We originally recorded this podcast in November 2023. In the intervening period, our guest, Jon Johannsen, has closed his architectural practice AJA, but he continues to work as an urban design consultant on several local government panels contributing to design excellence. Hello and welcome to the UrbanTalk Podcast, where we talk all things urban, demystify development and break down the barriers between the development sector and local communities. I'm your host, Belinda Barnett. Joining me today is Jon Johannsen. Jon is the principal of Architects Johannsen and Associates. He's an amazing architect and urban designer and has over 5 decades of professional experience. And for 35 of those years, he's been the principal of Architects Johannsen and Associates, or AJA as it's widely referred to. So welcome, Jon. It's so great to have you here for our podcast.
Thanks, Belinda. It's great to be here. I've followed some of the urban talks you've done and been impressed with the range of subjects and critical sort of issues that you're dealing with at a time that Sydney really needs to be thinking about how we're going to move forward.
Thanks, Jon. And today I think it's another really important matter that I've selected to discuss, and that's the process of design excellence and the role that it is playing in delivering quality urban outcomes. In this topic, we're also going to drill down pretty hard on the process of design review and the role that design review panels play, which are both intrinsic to the process of design excellence. It's an interesting term, design excellence. It's frequently used in planning and development circles. You'll often pick up a planning report such as a statement of environmental effects that says a project has achieved design excellence. But what does that actually mean? You know, some people might think it's just a subjective phrase that a planner who likes a project has decided to write into their statement of environmental effects. But that's not the case. It's actually a design process. And so I think it's really important that we break down what it means and to examine, I guess, the statutory and policy framework that exists around design excellence. And I couldn't think of a better person to discuss this topic with than you, given that you work on both sides of the fence, both as an architect designing projects in your own right, but also because you sit on so many design review panels, and so you're constantly called upon to provide critical expert advice to your peers and your colleagues when they are advancing new projects. So it's fabulous. You're also the recipient of many architectural awards. Great reading your CV. I think it'd be great to start by you sharing a little bit about your career highlights and some of the experience and the projects that you've delivered, and just where your underlying passion for design excellence comes from.
Thank you for that glowing overview. Certainly, the design review process, I think, has really evolved over the last couple of decades, and I think it's a really important part of the planning and development process moving forward, because we really have so many challenges in Sydney in dealing with how density and different approaches to the affordable housing issue, which is so critical, are going to be dealt with. So I guess perhaps just backtracking to how I came to where I am today. Backing 50 years, I suppose, to 1973 when I graduated from Adelaide University. Actually, one of the highlights, I suppose, during that time was 6 months I spent in Sydney. I managed to get a gig with a firm called Edwards Madigan, Torzillo and Briggs, who were doing the National Gallery project. And that really opened my eyes to, I guess, things you don't get exposed to at university. The quality of design on a national level and the political and development procedures that compromise things. And from there, I then came back working in Adelaide and found it a little bit sort of limited in terms of the potential. I did get a short time with a firm called Urban Systems, working on the City of Adelaide plan, which was evolving, I suppose, out of Colonel Light's wonderful grid layout and garden city. And it had, the potential to really deliver placemaking and urban sort of activation for a city that was somewhat lacking in that at the time. And I was hoping that was going to continue, but things didn't quite work out. I then ended up moving into private practice for a short time, and then ended up with the Hassel office in Adelaide initially, and then in Sydney. They offered me a potential move, and having already enjoyed Sydney earlier, I came across and was in a wonderful studio environment. That was an interesting time, and from there I ended up with an opportunity to move on to Philip Cox and Partners in 1984. The potential then for involvement in projects that were being done for the bicentenary, 1988. The office had the Exhibition Centre in Darling Harbour, the Maritime Museum, football stadium at Moore Park. The office gave me the opportunity to work on the National Convention Centre in Canberra, and I was the project director on that for a number of years until completion. In the opportunity to travel in 1978 it was, opened my eyes to what the urban realm could be in Europe, and I visited Foster's Sainsbury Centre, which was a wonderfully refined and an elegant building, and Rogers' wonderful Centre Pompidou in Paris, the other end of the spectrum in terms of a very bold and vibrant insertion into the Paris fabric. Certainly experiencing the various villages and cities and the different layers to those places gave me a different overview of what design excellence or design quality could be in a range of different places. And so then coming back and working in Canberra National Convention Centre project, a very substantial insertion into the fabric of Civic. When that was finished, there was a bit of a downturn in the economy. I ended up leaving Cox and setting up my practice at that point, 1988. And then, for the next 30 years, was involved in a range of smaller residential and commercial and adaptive reuse projects initially. And then that evolved over time. A great opportunity came through a Singaporean developer acquiring a site, which was the old Chevron hole in the ground. It was well known in front of Tusculum in Potts Point and overlooking another John Burge piece of architecture, Rockwell House. And that project, which was around 120 units, it was a challenging site. We achieved, I think, a really good outcome. Certainly a number of owners of units there have asked us to do work over the years. And the result of having that completed, it was picked up as one of the exemplars that was used in the Residential Flat Design Code pattern book, which evolved from then Premier Bob Carr's interest in trying to raise the standard of design quality in unit buildings. I think he often drove home along Anzac Parade and admired or attempted to see what the merits were in some of the multi-unit high-rise developments. And so he pushed very hard to get the Department of Planning to help bring the Residential Flat Design Code into being. And I think that really did sort of then, as it evolved then into SEP 65, begin the process of how design excellence would be able to be dealt with by local councils. And a number of SEP 65 panels were then set up through the late 2000s and have evolved over a period of time through the later introduction of the Apartment Design Guide, I think in 2015. So I became involved in some of those earlier panels with Liverpool and Parramatta. But in the meantime, we also were doing other projects. We managed to get a very wonderful opportunity to work on the Martin Place renewal for the City Olympics. That was in the late 2000s. Then did a range of other adaptive reuse and multi-unit projects, commercial projects, adaptive reuse projects like where your office is at Georges Heights. And I think, that was a great opportunity to get involved in something that's on a very unique headland. So that's a quick overview of where I've come from. And I currently sit on, 6 different panels, Parramatta, Burwood, Inner West, Waverley, Hornsby.
Well, it's a very eclectic career, John, and you've certainly worked on a huge range of projects. And I think that highlights that when we start talking about design excellence, there's no set shape of what a project that is going to go through a design process for design excellence looks like. Design excellence can be applied to strategic planning policy projects or master planning projects or actually site-specific projects. Why is it, from your point of view, as a process, why is it so important that projects go through the design excellence process?
Design excellence, I think, unfortunately, the community at large perhaps get a different view of what design quality means when they watch programs like Grand Designs, for example, get some sort of marketing spin in terms of what people may be doing in those sort of programs. But in terms of design excellence for the sorts of projects that the panels look at, we're really dealing with a whole range of density and complexity in these projects, whether they're residential or more recently can be a whole range of different uses like adaptive reuse, commercial projects like the Bronte Surf Life Saving Club, which the Waverley panel has recently looked at. The quality of what we're putting in our public realm is so much in the view of the public. It's really important, I think, that the public have more confidence in how the changes to the urban environment are being handled, both at the high level and the day-to-day street level, where you've got everyone interacting as they're walking down around the streets.
Yeah, I really agree with you. And I guess one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast on design excellence, because I don't feel it is really understood. I mean, I've been a planner for 30 years, but I've never been to a design review panel, for example, for a project. So sometimes you don't have that in-depth appreciation of how a process influences an end urban outcome if you haven't had that first-hand experience. I'm sure there are many architects that when they appear before a design review panel for the first time would be quite apprehensive of thinking, what is this going to be like having my project reviewed by other experts? It's a mindset, isn't it? It's being open to receiving that advice, and it's just going to deliver a better project, having more eyes on, I guess, a scheme, whether that's a strategic policy scheme or a master plan for a big area or a site-specific project, just to make sure there is that rigour that's being applied to design and that end vision is going to fit comfortably within the local context that it's being proposed for. The New South Wales Office of the Government Architect, is currently Abby Galvin. I think she's the 24th Government Architect. So I was really interested to learn when I was researching for the podcast that the Office of the Government Architect had been around for 207 years. It sort of quite surprised me, really. How is the Office of the Government Architect promoting design excellence in New South Wales currently? What are the key building blocks that they are using to establish a credible and rigorous design excellence process?
Right, yeah, it's a really good question, because I think certainly the office has changed its method of operation in recent years, but it's great that they're picking up on design policy as a critical building block for the way in which development's going to be dealt with, where it's under pressure in terms of programs that are being requested or implied by the state government. And so in 2022, the Local Government Design Review Panel manual was put out, and also with the Department of Planning input, there's been documents like Better Placed and Designing with Country. And I think these are really critical policies to help show how local government can help local communities come to terms with the way in which design quality is being monitored and enabling better outcomes, especially where you've got the sort of challenges with heritage, with affordable housing, the increased densities that are being talked about, how these changes are going to be still delivering good quality design.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how we also see now in many local environmental plans that local councils have clauses in there that deal with design excellence, which then also set out, I guess, the process that they will follow for ensuring that design excellence happens on certain projects. When you talked earlier about, firstly, in its early iteration, the residential flat code, and then when it evolved in 2015 into the residential apartment design guide, do you see the design guide being one of the building blocks of design excellence that still is relied upon as part of the design excellence process?
Yes, I think the CEP 65 apartment design guide really did help to provide a broader structure to the way in which projects would be reviewed in the design review environment at local councils. It varies across the various councils as to what in fact does go under the microscope for design review. For example, at Hornsby, It can be any development comprising a residential flat building or a mixed-use development over 3 stories or a townhouse development. Hornsby is one of the few councils where they actually do require townhouse developments to go through design review, which I think is a good thing. Or any development which, in the opinion of the manager, is required to go through design excellence, which might be for a strategic or for a higher level of scrutiny for a particular public sort of site.
Do you think that the residential apartment design guide actually empowered the architectural profession to a certain degree because it required projects, residential projects particularly, to be accompanied by a design statement that was basically signed off by a registered architect?
The inclusion of that as part of the process, I think, was good because it means that there has to be that level of scrutiny that the applicant goes through in terms of ensuring that the various guidelines in the document are being attended to. And I think it gives the public more confidence if there is that sign-off by a registered architect that it's not being given less attention than it deserves.
We've talked a little bit about design review panels, but let's sort of drill down on their role in the design excellence process now. So you've talked about that there is a local government manual that was, I guess, drafted by the government architect, and that basically establishes the process of design review and how design review panels will operate. I just thought it would be useful just to read a little excerpt from that manual, just to clarify, I guess, what a design review panel is. So the manual states a design review panel is a panel of expert and independent design professionals that provide constructive feedback on the design quality of development proposals and strategic design projects. Participating in design review aims to help applicants, design teams, local councils and other consent authorities by providing expert, context-specific design advice that will contribute to improving the quality of the built environment and facilitate smooth assessment processes. I think it's a really succinct and good summary of what, I guess, the purpose of a design review panel is. You've mentioned previously, John, that you sit and have sat on numerous design review panels at a local government level: Liverpool, North Sydney, Burwood, Cumberland, Parramatta, Hornsby, Waverley and the Inner West. So that's a pretty diverse selection of local government areas that you've been providing advice within. Does the process of design review differ significantly between local government areas?
I think it's great that there is a broader sort of expectation that projects over a certain size certainly will now go through that design review process. And it's important to also realise that including architects, there are also landscape architects, heritage architects and urban designers on these panels. So it's giving a fairly broad range of consideration. And I think that's critical when you come to consider context and neighbourhood and the pressure that is coming from a lot of communities about how the projects that are being reviewed can be integrated into the existing fabric of the area or the evolving fabric, because obviously there are LEPs and DCPs that are being evolving as we see development pressures increase. And it's important to realise that we're planning for a future in which things will continue to change. One of the areas that is, I think, particularly of concern is having the scope for a pre-DA and having applicants come in early in the design review process so that there is the chance for concepts to be tested before they go too far, before a whole realm of other consultants then contribute to things that may well be not founded accurately or properly in the first place.
So just to clarify on that point, an applicant can
request
pre-DA for their project to go before a design review panel to get that early advice.
They might have a pre-lodgement meeting, and once the planners see the extent of what they're trying to achieve, whether it's within the controls that are there or whether they're testing the limits, that's often the case as well, that they're aiming for that little bit of extra floor space or height. So that's the atmosphere in which there can be a much broader overview to start with that enables a project to be able to deal with the critical issues
I'd imagine for large projects that might be strategic in nature, like a large master planning project for a significant urban area, that a project may go before a panel several times.
Point,
is that the case?
Hill Road, which Sekisui have been doing, and Sanctuary Point, I think we would have had close to a dozen meetings. So initially the master plan for that site, and there were 6 stages within that, evolved at a time when one particular stage was underway, but then the subsequent stages came back at various times. And it's important to reinforce that it is a design advisory panel. It's not a determination panel. That is something that is then picked up in the next stage by the planning panels that review these projects. And the design review panel minutes or reports are critical to how they're reviewed at the planning final determination. But on the site that Sekisui are developing at Wentworth Point, Sanctuary Point as it's called, we would have had a dozen meetings. There were some that were involving the master plan initially, and then later on the different stages, which were in some cases like at that pre-DA level and then the final DA. Yeah, it was a really, really useful process to see how the whole 6 stages would knit together and how the public domain that the site would then share with the broader public would be dealt with, because there's obviously connection to country potential in those sort of places. There's also the light rail that comes through there across from Carlingford, and how that whole area would be evolving. It was critical to have a range of different meetings at critical phases of that project. Indeed. And
I imagine it'd be very exciting to see a project like that and evolve through that process.
Which is the other side of the Parramatta River on Victoria Road. And so the panel has also been involved in the early phases of that in a similar way.
So I guess that leads me to, my next question. What triggers whether a project goes through a design review process? Is it very... I'd imagine that most probably differs between each LGA.
It does vary across the various councils, and I think that's one thing that would be good to have more consistency through design review manual. I think that's something hopefully will start to change in the next few years.
I would imagine that just in terms of those triggers, that where you've got a proponent or an applicant that is looking to advance a scheme that is seeking a variation to council controls, that getting the advice of the panel is really important. Do you provide an independent set of eyes, or that has the scope to support a variation? Because sometimes, with planning controls, you can't have like a one-size-fit-all set of controls that are going to work on every site. And a local variation is necessary. So do you feel like being a local government panel that you have that scope to be able to voice, say, support for a variation to a set of local controls?
A little bit of extra height, the extra units that obviously in a developer's sort of spreadsheet will determine the profitability of a project. And I think it's really up to the panel to make a call when you get a clause 4.6 variation, for example, as to whether there is merit there that the panel can support, whether you can see the design excellence that's being achieved in other ways that would justify. It would have to be a small increase. Anything substantial, I think it just would not fly. But certainly where there are, for example, a roof terrace that is proposed for the communal open space, and the lift overrun to access that and make it accessible, and perhaps the inclusion of shade structures that can be set back from the perimeter of the building. These are the sorts of changes that can be really supported in that process, and trying to find ways in which developments can add value for the residents of a flat building or to the broader public domain, the way in which they might be able to contribute more to the streetscape and the activation around the perimeter of the site.
great to know that you can actually bring that independent voice to the table. A lot of your involvement that you've spoken about has been local government based.
Does
the process of design review apply to state significant projects?
I'm not involved in the state design review panel process, but certainly on the Government Architects website they show a similar sort of format to how they deal with government-oriented projects and certainly planning proposals or anything significant.
That's good to be able to clarify that as well, that it is both a local and state-driven process. As an architect, how does it feel, I guess, to have your work critiqued when you go before a design review panel? Do you generally have a right of reply, or do you have to adopt a panel's recommendations?
Will be in terms of satisfying the criteria in the design review guidelines. It's not mandatory. It's obviously an advisory panel, but the way in which applicants come before the panel has obviously changed a bit over the last few years. Pre-COVID, it was always face-to-face, and you would often have a team of anywhere from 2 up to sometimes as many as a dozen when there's a lot of consultants on a big project. In the post-COVID or during COVID and post-COVID, it's become more of an online type of forum, either via Teams or Zoom. And I guess that's also been useful in terms of having access to a lot of reports and the ability to communicate things during the meeting on the wavelength of those platforms. So we usually have between, say,
how long would a session go with an applicant
on the size
who's presenting to a panel?
The process is usually one of the applicant will have provided background set of documents which were part of a pre-DA or a DA document that was submitted to council. And then we give them the opportunity for 10 to 15 minutes on a smaller project, perhaps half an hour if it's a bigger project, to present. And then there's a Q&A process where the panel will try to get an understanding of where the issues will be, how they want to respond to that is then up to them. We do have a backward and forward process during the meeting, but then the minutes are provided, and if they need to come back, the panel will make it quite clear that there are certain issues that have to be dealt with in order for that to be looked at, or if it's really significantly out of kilter with the expectations, then they're told to basically go away and start again. It's a frequent sort of occurrence.
Does that happen very often?
The expectations
basically
are beyond
an applicant's told to go back to the drawing board?
Controls initiated by something that's a change of use or a substantial overreach in terms of the built form that they're looking for.
I guess new developments, and particularly, I guess, the high-density residential projects are often causing heightened community anxiety. It's frequently being in the media. You said earlier that you feel that the design review panel should build confidence within local communities about the urban design outcomes or the architectural outcomes that are being achieved. Do you feel that communities are having greater confidence in the end design outcome?
There are some communities that just don't want increased density and that's it. But certainly there are areas where I think great outcomes have been achieved, and I think that really is encouraging. But then there are areas where, I'll use St Leonard's as an example, which is in my own sort of neighbourhood, where you've got 3 different councils at a fulcrum. We've got North Sydney, Willoughby and Lane Cove. And there's been some real challenges there in terms of finding the right formula for increased density, which is substantial. And then you've got the South St Leonard's area beyond that, which I think you're familiar with as well. So I think that the community have a lot of concerns in those areas where it's not been possible, I suppose, for the transparency of the design review process to be fully understood. The panels came
generally speaking. Do you think design review panels have improved the overall quality of development in Sydney?
Some of the stuff he'd seen down the Anzac Parade. Certainly at that time, I think there were a lot of unit developments where there was a very poor standard. And I think it's really helped to lift the quality of the outcomes at that lower level, where the expectation and the requirement for design to be signed off by a registered architect and not a designer has really changed the structure of the system. And then I think beyond that, there's been some really good exemplary outcomes in certain areas where the public, I think, have really seen the benefits of it. Include areas like Rouse Hill, for example, I think is a great example of those higher density areas around transport centre, and we've certainly got a few of those now evolving with the metro coming. And I think that's really, really critical, that where the increased densities are going to happen around our new metro system, that there is continued public confidence in how the densities are going to be handled, and the public domain that goes with that is going to be improved to justify a lot of difficulties that are being dealt with along the way.
We're certainly seeing in the media, and certainly it's been suggested by some developers and developer advocates, that the process of design review is adding unnecessary complexity and time to the development approval process. Do you think this is the case? And is there room to further improve the design review and design excellence processes that we have in place?
Will delay the outcome of larger developments. I think there's certainly got to be scrutiny as they move forward, and the final determination, I think, will be aided by design review, especially if it's done early. If there is a pre-DA involvement, it should not, in my mind, delay the overall delivery process.
It might be sort of timely then to look at what we're starting to hear around new housing policy. In November 2023, the Minns government launched its new housing initiatives to address housing supply shortages. We do have a housing supply shortage.
Absolutely.
And we all have to act together to look at how we can achieve planning reform to get more housing out there. So that's not to be debated. But a lot of the new initiatives are looking at fast-tracking buildings that choose to use high-quality pre-approved designs. And frequently that's being referred to as the introduction of a pattern book. I mean, you've said earlier, pattern books aren't new. They have been used historically, and they've been used certainly overseas. And it's sounding like that the pattern books is going to include both low-rise housing designs for things like terraces, semis, manor houses, and also apartment buildings for up to 6 stories in height. Some of the media that's been put out is suggesting that the government architect is to lead a process of developing these pre-approved designs in conjunction with the private sector, a design competition, and invite, I guess, international and local architects and architecture design schools to put forward designs for, I guess, low-rise and these medium-rise housing typologies, and the winning designs would then be included in the pattern book. What's your thinking around that? Is that a good approach being taken by the government architect?
For developers to use, where there are good quality designs that can be repeated, but the cookie-cutter type of outcome that is not necessarily able to be put into a certain context without raising a whole range of issues, I think that's going to be difficult. I think it's going to require some way of still having a review process before they are delivered. Now, how that's going to be handled is a big question mark. Certainly you would hope that there would be quite a high level of review of the actual competition results when they do come out, and I'm certainly it'll be picked up in the media and certainly in social media in terms of dialogue about what may or may not be acceptable. We look at examples of where a pattern book, could say, for the Paddington Terrace has been very successful at a time when Sydney was obviously growing. The terrace became a fantastic template for a lot of inner city housing that then, of course, went from higher levels to lower levels in terms of the socio-economic realm at the time. And, of course, now they're very much sought after, and they're a really great model. And I think, when you fly into Sydney and you see the huge array of single houses and think about all the space that's wasted in so many suburban areas, you'd like to think that we do have room for a lot of infill in certain areas. We're not saying, that you won't have the ability to buy a single house. That'll still be the case. But I think certainly there's a hell of a lot of scope for increasing the missing middle opportunities, which can provide for a whole range of different typologies of family and individual expectation around the density nodes and spreading out from those nodes where the metro will be, for example.
Yeah, it would just be a shame, I think. I mean, we've talked about the various building blocks of the design excellence process. We've seen the work that has been led and chartered by the government architect, with the manual for design review panels, even dating back to 2015 with the residential apartment design code, and certainly the recent work that's been done from the department with the Designing with Country frameworks that have been put out there. It would be a shame to see that work being pushed to one side as we try to accelerate housing delivery. It's a very fine line to understand how you achieve the correct balance, how you can achieve a fast tracking of residential projects, but not do that in such a way that compromises local character, I think. What are your thoughts? If you had to sit down with a coffee with the government architect, what would you be suggesting to her about how we could achieve a better balance and incorporate the design review panel, given your vast 50-year experience in providing design review?
We're all hoping
how do you think it could best be done?
Of maintaining the high quality of our living environment in Sydney, and really I think we are blessed with fantastic urban areas, even though there are challenges. Look, I think that there is going to be sort of like an acupuncture type of process where you really need to look at where the pressure points are and what can be done to integrate within those areas. But it comes back to the context, because we have such a broad spectrum of fine grain to higher density across the whole of the Sydney metropolitan area. I think it would also be really great if we had more flexibility in terms of some of the ways in which density can be dealt with. So, having more areas like Surrey Hills, for example, the mixed use that can happen around some of the denser areas where you can actually integrate pockets where there can be different types of housing for manor houses or for affordable housing, along with the higher level. And I think Surrey Hills does that very well. And I think also areas like Marrickville and the Inner West Council, we're seeing a lot of challenging sites there. And this is where I think the pattern will be difficult, where you've got sites that are very, very small insertions in between the existing fabric. And then you've also got the heritage overlay, which is another big aspect of how that's going to be dealt with in a number of council areas.
Just on the heritage, I mean, that's already proving to be a little bit controversial at the moment. We're seeing in the media certainly articles appearing raising concern at councils that are using the delineation of heritage conservation areas as a tool to block higher density and new housing development. My personal view is that it's a broken system when councils feel they have to rely on those types of planning controls to basically what they see, I guess, to preserve local character. There clearly needs to be a greater degree of consultation occurring between state and local governments by the state government, I guess, in the delineation of new housing policy. I mean, I fully recognise that we need to deliver more housing, but I just think it's starting to look a little bit broken when we're seeing those sorts of mechanisms being used by local government to fight back against state-driven housing policy.
Sydney over the last 20 years is a huge build-up of the use of consultation via social media, for example, to raise issues. And that's, I guess, in an area that you're obviously dealing with on a regular basis yourself, consultation process to understand where things are going to work or not, and what is really tantamount to a heritage overreach versus what's reasonable. It's certainly something that's on the agenda in the Inner West at the moment, but also on the North Shore, and justifiably, conservation zones in some areas are really, really important to maintain. Paddington's a classic example of that. But we do have the potential for a lot of those models that can incorporate adaptive reuse, for example, of the existing fabric. That's where planning, I think, needs to be more flexible, so we can actually have ways of providing a broader spectrum of housing that is not necessarily following the models that we've had for the last 50 or 60 years.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And you know, just on the back of that, it's hard to see where,
expect, if
say,
it's
a pattern book
a
may actually help that process.
Or if it's one of the infill sites, larger sort of industrial estates, Camellia, for example, and the Rosehill Racecourse, there's certainly scope in those areas. But I think elsewhere, infill sites are going to be very, very hard to see how the pattern book type of approach will work. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, particularly a pattern book without a design review process. Yeah, so as I said, look, I haven't seen the detail yet. You haven't seen the detail yet. I think we're all waiting to see the fine print of the housing policies. Hopefully they will be released and they will be put out to robust consultation by community groups, by professionals like yourself and myself, so that we can take a closer look and put our ideas forward. It's an interesting time, I think, a very interesting time for us all to be working
like
in this space.
Electrification of buildings, these are other things that the panels are dealing with on a regular basis, and they also need to be part of the consideration of what maintains higher levels of design excellence. And then cars.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, the whole sustainability question hasn't even been discussed in any of this.
It could be a whole further subject, indeed.
Yeah, no, there's a lot. It's there's many podcasts in this subject. Well, I might bring it to a close, John. But thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed our discussion. Design excellence is an important design process that has been built into the New South Wales planning system, and we want to ensure that it does absolutely stay part of the process that is used daily by planners to assess new development. As someone who plays a big role in design review, it's been great to get your candid views and your insights into the process. You know, as I said earlier, I mean, I've been a planner for like 30 years and I've never been before a design review panel. So it's been great to hear what is actually happening and to get your industry-wide views about design review and design excellence, and just to talk with you about some of the challenges that we will see ahead as we look to accelerate housing provision. So thank you very much for giving me your time today. It will indeed. If you have enjoyed the podcast, please consider leaving a review on your podcast app of choice to help the show. If you have a development project that needs an online presence or community engagement, head to urbantalk.com.au and contact us to get started. We'll continue to invite guests to speak on a variety of topics. If you have a topic that you would like to hear, please send it through via the Urban Talk website or email me directly at belinda@urbantalk.com.au. For updates on Urban Talk, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. My name is Belinda Barnett, and thank you for listening to the Urban Talk Podcast.